All right, let's get right into it. You've probably seen the headlines. The U.S. is beefing up its military presence in the Middle East. But at the exact same time, there are these super high-stakes negotiations happening with Iran over its nuclear program. It's a lot of tension in the air.
And this really brings us to a huge fork in the road, one that could totally define the region for decades. Are we heading down the path of negotiation, or is it time for a direct confrontation? Well, according to retired four-star General Jack Keane, the answer is way clearer, and honestly, more urgent than you might think.
Now, on the surface, it seems like diplomacy is the only real option on the table. We're hearing from senior officials that key U.S. allies, like Saudi Arabia, have gone on the record saying they would not let the U.S. use their bases or even their airspace for a strike against Iran.
But right away, General Keane says, hold on a minute. He's basically telling us to take those public statements with a huge grain of salt. He argues that what's said behind closed doors is a completely different ballgame. And honestly, this idea is the key to his entire argument.
So what is his argument exactly? Well, for Keane, this isn't just another flare-up in the Middle East. No, he sees this moment as a truly unique, once-in-a-generation opportunity that demands decisive military action, not just more talking.
And this slide really gets to the heart of it. Keane believes that a smart, targeted military strike right now could do way more than just damage Iran's military. He thinks it could actually set the regime itself on a pathway to collapse. I mean, that's a massive claim, so let's unpack how he gets there. To really get why Keane feels this urgency, you have to look back. He frames his whole argument against the backdrop of over 40 years of U.S. policy toward Iran, a history that he pretty much sees as one big story of missed opportunities. So the way Keane lays it out, ever since 1980, 7 different U.S. presidents just kind of stood by while the Iranian regime got more powerful and spread instability. He even uses the word appeasement for some of their policies. In his view, President Trump broke that cycle with what he calls the decisive blow of taking out Qasem Soleimani. And all of that history, he says, has led us to this very moment, what he sees as a massive strategic opening.
Which brings us right back to today. For Keane, the choice the administration is facing couldn't be more black and white, and the outcomes couldn't be more different.
And what's so fascinating here is just how clearly he lays out the stakes. In his mind, a new nuclear deal isn't a solution. It's a lifeline for a regime that's on the ropes. He says it would be a total gut punch to the protesters in the streets. A military strike, on the other hand, that would weaken the regime, sow division among its leaders, and, there it is again, put it on that pathway to collapse.
And this, right here, is the absolute game changer in his view. It's the protest movement happening inside Iran. He argues that these protesters, who are fighting for their own freedom, have totally changed the strategic math. They don't care about a nuclear deal, they want a new future.
And to really drive home just how intense this internal struggle is, Keane points to one single staggering number: 30,000.
That is his high-end estimate for how many protesters may have been killed by the regime. To him, that number is proof of 2 things: the regime's sheer desperation and the unbelievable courage of the people rising up against it.
Okay, but let's talk about the elephant in the room. The second you mention a military strike on Iran, one giant question mark appears over everything: the risk of a much, much bigger war. So how does Keane tackle that?
I mean, this is the question, right? If the U.S. strikes, won't Iran and all its proxies just unleash hell and drag the entire region into a massive, devastating conflict?
Keane's answer starts with a pretty blunt assessment of his opponent. He basically says anyone who fears a huge regional war just doesn't understand the facts on the ground. He describes the current Iranian regime as a mere shadow of its former self, the weakest it has ever been politically, economically, and militarily.
And building on that point, he lays out his case. First, the U.S. has already moved some serious firepower into the region, both for defense and offense. These forces can do more than just block an attack. They can launch devastating counterstrikes on Iran's missile sites, its leaders, and its crucial oil infrastructure. Because of all this, Keane argues that Iran's threats are mostly just bluster and rhetoric, not what they're actually capable of doing.
So if the risks are as manageable as Keane says they are, what's the ultimate goal here? What's the grand prize he's envisioning?
Well, this isn't about just winning a small battle. Keane is talking about a complete paradigm shift. He sees this as a chance to totally redraw the strategic map of the entire Middle East for generations.
And that leads us to this incredibly powerful statement.
Speaking about the president making this decision, Keane says he will have changed the Middle East for decades to come. I mean, in his view, the stakes just don't get any higher than that.
So, when you boil it all down, General Keane has laid out this incredibly detailed case for a decisive military strike. He's framing it as a historic opportunity to finally change the dynamic of a conflict that's been going on for nearly half a century. But the question that's left on the table is a big one. Is this a visionary strategic opening, or is it an incredibly dangerous gamble?